The quickest way to discover who truly respects you is to let them believe you've already lost. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 42 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, most people inside Meridian Global Holdings believed I was nothing more than a man who had somehow gotten lucky enough to marry one of their brightest executives. They saw the tailored suit I wore and assumed it had been bought with my wife's paycheck. They noticed the quiet way I stood beside her and mistook patience for weakness. They saw a husband without a visible title and decided I had no value. Funny how easily people confuse silence with failure. The headquarters of Meridian rose above downtown Chicago like a monument built from glass and ambition. 47 stories reflected the gray November sky, while executives hurried through revolving doors carrying leather briefcases, expensive coffee, and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing tomorrow already belongs to them. I stepped out of the black SUV exactly 30 minutes before the quarterly board meeting, adjusted the cuff of my navy jacket, and looked up at the building I hadn't entered in nearly 12 years. Nothing about the place had really changed. The marble entrance still echoed with polished shoes. The brass logo still caught the morning sunlight. Even the security desk still smelled faintly of fresh coffee and printer paper. Only the faces were different. Or maybe I was. Madison climbed out beside me without saying a word. Her emerald business suit fit perfectly, every detail carefully chosen to project success. She had spent the last decade becoming one of Meridian's rising stars, the executive everyone expected to climb another rung on the corporate ladder before the end of the year. She glanced toward the entrance, barely acknowledging that I was walking beside her. That had become our routine over the past 2 years. Short conversations, careful smiles, two people sharing a last name while living completely separate emotional lives. There was a time when she reached for my hand before every important meeting because she believed I brought her luck. There was a time when she would ask my opinion before making any major decision. Somewhere along the way, success had become louder than gratitude. Somewhere along the way, admiration quietly turned into embarrassment. We crossed the lobby together, passing employees who greeted Madison with warm smiles and respectful nods. "Good morning, Ms. Caldwell. Looking forward to today's meeting. Congratulations in advance." She thanked each of them with practiced confidence, accepting compliments she hadn't officially earned yet. Rumors spread quickly inside companies like Meridian. Everyone believed today's board session would end with her promotion to executive vice president. She believed it too. The elevator carried us toward the executive floor in complete silence. 43, 44, 45. I watched our reflections in the mirrored walls. She stood perfectly straight, checking a notification on her phone. I stood beside her with my hands folded calmly in front of me. Two strangers wearing wedding rings. As the doors opened onto the 47th floor, the atmosphere changed immediately. Thick carpet muted every footstep. Original artwork lined the hallway. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan stretching beneath the cloudy horizon. This was where Meridian's real decisions happened. Wealth rarely announced itself loudly. It preferred quiet hallways and closed doors. Madison smiled the moment she spotted Brandon Pierce waiting near the conference room entrance. Brandon was Senior Vice President of Operations, charismatic, ambitious, and convinced the world rewarded confidence more than character. He greeted Madison first with obvious enthusiasm before finally noticing me. "Well, look who's here." Ethan made it. Brandon flashed the kind of smile people mistake for kindness until they become its target. Madison laughed softly. I almost couldn't convince him to come. He's been spending a lot of time at home lately. Brandon chuckled. "Must be nice. No deadlines. No investors breathing down your neck." I returned a polite smile. It has its moments. Before I could say anything else, one of the board members approached Madison carrying a folder filled with financial reports. He glanced toward me with genuine curiosity. "Madison, I don't believe we've met your husband before." She didn't hesitate. Her smile widened just enough to entertain the people standing nearby. "Oh, this is Ethan. He's my jobless husband. I figured I'd bring him along so he could finally see what real work looks like." The laughter came almost instantly. Light at first, then louder. Brandon shook his head as though she'd delivered the funniest line of the morning. Someone behind him laughed into a coffee cup. Another executive smiled awkwardly before joining in anyway. I simply looked around the room, memorizing every face, every voice, every expression, Because sometimes people reveal their true character long before they realize anyone is paying attention. The laughter lingered for another few seconds before fading beneath the polished rhythm of executive conversation. But something about it stayed suspended in the air, like perfume after someone leaves a room. Nobody apologized. Nobody looked uncomfortable for very long. That was the strange thing about corporate culture. Once enough people laughed together, kindness suddenly became expensive. Brandon stepped beside me and casually patted my shoulder as though we were old friends. You know, Ethan, Meridian is always looking for dependable people. Security, reception, maybe facilities management. Nothing wrong with honest work. Another executive smirked over the rim of his coffee cup. Employee discounts are not bad either. I smiled politely. Thank you. I will keep that in mind. Brandon seemed almost disappointed that I refused to react. Men like him lived for visible emotion. Anger made them feel powerful. Silence confused them. Madison accepted another congratulation from one of the vice presidents before turning toward me with the same patient smile someone might give a relative who had wandered into the wrong room. Just stay close to the back during the meeting, all right? The board sessions can get complicated. I nodded once. I am sure I will be able to follow. She gave a tiny laugh that barely concealed her disbelief. Years ago, she would have known exactly how ironic that sentence really was. Today, she heard only what she expected to hear. Expectations have a remarkable way of editing reality. The conference room doors opened, revealing a long walnut table surrounded by black leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the northern wall, offering a sweeping view of Lake Michigan disappearing beneath low clouds. A massive digital display already showed quarterly financial reports waiting for discussion. Crystal water pitchers reflected the morning light, while neatly arranged folders rested in front of each director's seat. I had helped approve the original architectural drawings for this room more than a decade earlier, although almost nobody present knew that. Every detail had been designed to communicate stability, discipline, and permanence. Funny how buildings often outlast memories. I quietly chose a chair near the rear wall, while Madison took her place closer to the center of the table beside Brandon. She looked exactly where she believed she belonged. Ambition had always suited her. It was insecurity disguised as confidence that slowly changed everything. Watching her organized presentation, notes reminded me of another morning nearly 15 years earlier inside a tiny apartment overlooking the Chicago River. Back then, we shared one old kitchen table that doubled as a dining room, office, and planning desk. We could not afford matching chairs. We celebrated takeout pizza whenever one of us accomplished something meaningful. Madison used to sit across from me with a yellow notebook full of dreams. She believed success meant building something together. Every evening, she asked about investor meetings, prototype designs, and hiring plans. She listened with genuine curiosity because my victories felt like hers. Somewhere between promotions, bonuses, magazine interviews, and executive retreats, the questions slowly disappeared. She no longer asked what I believed. She only cared what other successful people believed. It happened so gradually that neither of us noticed the distance growing until it had become impossible to cross. My phone vibrated softly inside my jacket pocket, bringing me back to the present. One message appeared on the screen. It came from Daniel. Harper, the only person inside Meridian who still knew the entire story. Everything is ready. The legal documents have been verified. Waiting for your instruction. I stared at the message for several seconds before typing a single word. Proceed. The response arrived almost immediately. Understood. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. My heartbeat never changed. The calm people mistake for weakness is often nothing more than preparation completed long before anyone else entered the room. Across the table, Brandon leaned toward Madison, speaking quietly enough that he assumed I could not hear. Once today is over, Executive Vice President looks good on you. She smiled. One step at a time. After that, maybe Chief Executive Officer someday. She laughed softly. Let us survive this meeting first. They both sounded certain the future had already signed their names. Confidence built on incomplete information has always been one of the most fragile things in business. At exactly 9 o'clock, the final board member entered, followed by corporate counsel carrying several thick binders. Conversations immediately stopped. Chairs slid quietly across the carpet as everyone settled into place. The room grew still with the disciplined silence that always arrives just before decisions capable of changing lives. I folded my hands together beneath the table and looked toward the empty chair reserved for the acting chairman. In a few moments, every assumption inside this room would begin collapsing under the weight of facts that had been waiting patiently for years. The acting chairman, Harold Whitmore, entered without ceremony, carrying only a slim leather portfolio that looked almost empty. At 70 years old, he no longer wasted energy trying to impress anyone. Respect had followed him for decades, and people naturally lowered their voices the moment he sat down. He adjusted his reading glasses, glanced around the room, and offered a calm smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Good morning, everyone. We have several important matters to address today, so let us begin." The digital display illuminated with quarterly revenue charts, market forecasts, and acquisition reports. One executive after another presented polished slides filled with percentages, projections, and carefully rehearsed optimism. Madison spoke with confidence, explaining how her division had exceeded performance expectations for the third consecutive quarter. She answered every question smoothly. She looked exactly like someone standing one step away from the biggest promotion of her career. Around the table, approving nods followed nearly every sentence she delivered. Brandon smiled proudly beside her, as though her success somehow validated his own judgment. I remained silent near the back of the room, listening far more carefully than anyone realized. Numbers often tell two different stories. One belongs to presentations. The other belongs to people who know where those numbers were born. As another executive discussed expansion into new markets, my attention drifted toward the framed photograph hanging near the conference room entrance. Most people probably walked past it every day without looking closely. It showed Meridian's first headquarters nearly 20 years earlier, a modest brick warehouse on the west side of Chicago. The building barely deserved the title of headquarters. The roof leaked whenever heavy rain rolled through. Half the desks had been purchased secondhand. During winter, we kept portable heaters beneath our chairs because the heating system failed almost every other week. Looking at that photograph pulled me backward through time with surprising clarity. I remembered carrying folding tables up narrow stairs because we could not afford professional movers. I remembered writing payroll checks late at night, praying every signature would clear the bank the following morning. I remembered interviewing engineers inside empty conference rooms because there was no furniture yet. Most of all, I remembered Madison bringing homemade sandwiches every Friday evening while our small team worked long after sunset. She used to sit on the corner of my desk, smiling every time another contract came through. "One day this company will have glass walls and board meetings," she told me once while wrapping her hands around a paper coffee cup. "When that day comes, promise me we will never become people who look down on others." I smiled at the memory because promises often sound strongest before success begins negotiating with them. We both believed we were building a company. We never imagined the company would slowly rebuild us into different people. Harold's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Excellent work, everyone. Before we move to leadership recommendations, Corporate Counsel has requested several procedural items." A few executives shifted impatiently in their seats. Procedural items usually meant paperwork. Nothing exciting. Brandon leaned toward Madison again. "Almost there," he whispered. She nodded confidently. "I know." Across the room, I noticed Daniel Harper entering quietly through the side door, carrying 3 thick binders and a sealed envelope. Most people barely acknowledged him. Daniel had served as Meridian's chief legal advisor for nearly 18 years. He rarely attracted attention because lawyers were expected to remain invisible until something became complicated. Today, complicated had finally arrived. Daniel walked directly toward Harold, handed him the envelope, and quietly spoke a few words that nobody else could hear. Harold's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Recognition. He opened the envelope, carefully reviewed the documents inside, then looked across the room with a seriousness that immediately silenced every lingering side conversation. Brandon stopped smiling. Madison straightened slightly in her chair, assuming this was simply another formality delaying her promotion by a few minutes. Harold removed his glasses, folded them neatly onto the table, and spoke with measured precision. "Before we continue with nominations, corporate governance requires that we first address a matter concerning voting authority and shareholder representation. Several directors exchanged puzzled glances. One quietly flipped through the meeting agenda, searching for the corresponding page. It was not there. Harold continued anyway. Certain trust documents have recently completed a long-standing legal review. As a result, the official allocation of controlling voting rights must now be entered into today's permanent record before any leadership vote can legally proceed. Brandon frowned. I was not informed about any trust review. Daniel answered calmly. The review remained confidential under existing agreements until this morning. The room grew noticeably quieter. Madison looked toward Brandon, then toward Harold, uncertainty replacing the confidence she had worn all morning. I simply watched the sunlight move slowly across the polished walnut table, waiting with the same patience that had carried me through 12 long years. Some truths are like seeds planted deep beneath frozen ground. For a very long time they appear completely lifeless. Then one ordinary morning, without warning, they finally break through the surface where everyone can see what had been growing all along. Daniel placed the 3 binders on the polished table with the quiet confidence of a man who knew every page inside them had already survived years of legal scrutiny. Nobody reached for the documents immediately. The room had entered that strange moment where instinct tells people something important is about to happen, even before their minds understand why. Harold looked around the table, one careful face at a time, before speaking again. These records concern the Caldwell Family Trust, established 12 years ago and administered under Delaware corporate law. The review process has now concluded. Today's board is legally obligated to acknowledge the ownership structure before conducting any leadership vote. Brandon frowned deeper. With all due respect, what does a family trust have to do with Meridian's governance? Daniel answered without raising his voice. Everything. The single word settled over the room like fresh snow. One director quietly adjusted his glasses, while another leaned forward to study the cover page that Daniel slid across the table. Madison glanced toward the documents, then back toward Harold, obviously expecting someone else to explain why the meeting had suddenly changed direction. She had spent weeks preparing financial presentations and promotion strategies. She had not prepared for legal history. Daniel opened the first binder. Approximately 12 years ago, following a major corporate restructuring, the original founder transferred controlling shares into an irrevocable trust to protect the company's long-term independence from hostile acquisition attempts. Brandon interrupted. Original founder? Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Most of Meridian's current leadership had joined after that restructuring. They knew the company had grown rapidly, but few had ever questioned the details of its earliest years. Successful corporations often rewrite their own history one retirement at a time. Daniel continued. The founder voluntarily stepped away from operational leadership while retaining beneficial ownership through the trust agreement. Public records reflected management changes, but ownership remained legally protected under confidential governance provisions approved unanimously by the board at that time. Madison slowly turned toward Harold. I thought Richard Langford built Meridian into what it is today. Harold smiled gently. Richard expanded Meridian. That is true, but he did not build Meridian. The room became even quieter. I watched sunlight reflect across the conference table exactly the way it had years earlier inside our first warehouse office. Except back, then the light bounced off scratched folding tables instead of polished walnut. Memory has an interesting way of ignoring expensive furniture. It always returns to the places where dreams first learned how difficult reality could become. I remembered the winter our largest client canceled a contract only 3 days before payroll. Snow covered Chicago for nearly a week. I slept on a couch inside the office because I could not justify paying for both heating at home and electricity at work. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried someone's mortgage or college tuition behind it. Madison stayed beside me during those nights. She wrapped herself in a company sweatshirt that was 2 sizes too large and filled out invoices while I negotiated emergency financing over the phone. We believed hardship was temporary because purpose made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Looking back, now, I sometimes wonder whether success slowly erased those memories for her, or whether she simply chose to remember a different version of our story. Daniel turned another page. The trust agreement also required that the controlling shareholder remain inactive in day-to-day operations until predetermined legal conditions had been satisfied. Those conditions expired earlier this month. One board member finally spoke. Are you telling us the controlling owner has been silent all these years? Daniel nodded. Yes. Does that individual intend to sell? No. Does that individual intend to replace executive management? Daniel closed the binder. Those decisions belong exclusively to the controlling shareholder. Brandon forced a nervous smile. Well, perhaps we should invite this mystery owner to our next meeting. A few uncertain chuckles drifted across the room, but they disappeared almost immediately. Nobody seemed interested in laughing anymore. Madison folded her hands together on the table. It was the first time all morning that I noticed genuine uncertainty in her expression. Confidence had slowly given way to curiosity, and curiosity was beginning to make room for concern. She glanced briefly toward me, perhaps noticing for the first time that I seemed remarkably calm for someone who had supposedly wandered into a board meeting with nothing meaningful to do. Our eyes met only for a second before she looked away again. 12 years of assumptions are difficult to abandon in a single morning. Harold reached for the final sealed folder lying beside Daniel. Its heavy cream paper carried Meridian's embossed corporate seal pressed into dark blue wax. He rested one hand gently across the unopened document before speaking. There remains one final procedural requirement before nominations may begin. Every chair in the room seemed perfectly still. Outside the windows, the clouds over Lake Michigan drifted slowly east, while downtown traffic continued as though nothing extraordinary was unfolding 47 stories above the streets. Inside the boardroom, however, the future of Meridian had quietly reached the point where one signature, one name, and one long-hidden truth would change every conversation that had taken place that morning. Harold broke the dark blue wax seal with deliberate care, unfolded the document inside, and allowed several quiet seconds to pass before reading the first line. Nobody moved. Even the steady hum of the building's ventilation system suddenly seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Pursuant to the Caldwell Family Trust and the governing bylaws of Meridian Global Holdings, he began, his voice calm and precise. The controlling shareholder has formally resumed all voting authority effective immediately following the completion of the legal review dated November 3rd. Brandon leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with visible impatience. All right, he said. Who is it? Harold looked toward Daniel instead of answering directly. Daniel opened the second binder and removed a certified ownership ledger bearing multiple notarized seals. He placed copies before every voting director. One by one, pages began turning. Eyes scanned percentages, signatures, dates, legal references. The expressions around the table shifted almost in unison. Curiosity became disbelief. Disbelief slowly gave way to realization. One elderly director quietly removed his glasses and read the first page again as though expecting different words to appear. Another looked across the room toward me, then back down at the document, then toward Harold again. Madison frowned, clearly trying to understand why several board members had suddenly stopped looking at the paperwork and started looking in my direction instead. She reached for her own copy and quickly flipped to the ownership summary. Her eyes paused. She blinked once. Then again. I watched the color slowly leave her face, not because someone had accused her of anything, but because certainty had begun collapsing beneath facts she could not argue with. 12 years is a long time to believe a story without asking who wrote it. Brandon leaned toward her. What does it say? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she continued reading every line with increasing concentration. Finally, she looked up at Daniel. This cannot be right. Daniel met her gaze. Without emotion. The documentation has been reviewed by 3 independent firms and confirmed through the Delaware Court of Chancery. It is entirely correct. Brandon reached across the table and picked up her copy without asking permission. He scanned the page quickly before his confident smile disappeared for the first time since the meeting began. No, he muttered almost to himself. That is impossible. Harold folded his hands together. Nothing here is impossible, Mr. Pierce. It has simply remained confidential. The room fell into another long silence. During that silence, my thoughts drifted back to the evening I signed the trust documents. Richard Langford had been sitting across from me inside a small law office overlooking the river. Meridian had just survived an aggressive acquisition attempt that nearly tore the company apart. We understood something had to change. Richard believed the business needed a public face willing to remain in the spotlight every day. I believed the company needed stable ownership protected from quarterly politics and impatient investors. We were both right. I stepped away from operational leadership because I wanted Meridian to grow beyond one personality. The trust protected the company while allowing experienced executives to build its future. I never expected anonymity to become permanent. I certainly never expected the woman who once watched me assemble desks inside an empty warehouse to eventually introduce me as someone with no purpose at all. Life has a quiet sense of irony. The sacrifices nobody remembers often become the foundation everyone stands upon. Daniel closed the ownership binder and spoke again. The trust currently controls 51% of Meridian's voting shares through its consolidated holdings. Under the bylaws, that ownership carries final authority regarding board composition, governance matters, and the nomination of the chairman. One director slowly nodded. Then legally we cannot proceed until the controlling shareholder is recognized. Correct, Daniel replied. Another director glanced toward the empty chair beside Harold. Is the shareholder joining us remotely? Harold smiled gently. No. Brandon forced an uneasy laugh. Well, I think we have all waited long enough. Whoever this person is, perhaps we should invite them into the room. Nobody answered him. Instead, every member of the board slowly turned toward the rear of the conference room almost at the same moment. It was not coordinated. No signal had been given. They had simply reached the same conclusion together after reading the same documents. Madison followed their eyes. So did Brandon. Their attention finally settled on the quiet man who had spent the entire morning sitting near the back wall without asking for recognition, without defending himself, and without correcting a single insult. I remained seated exactly where I had been since the meeting began. My hands rested calmly on the table. My breathing never changed. Outside, weak sunlight finally broke through the clouds above Lake Michigan, sending a bright reflection across the glass walls of the boardroom. Inside, the weight of 12 silent years settled over every person present, and for the first time that morning, nobody in the room seemed interested in hearing another joke. No one spoke. The silence itself seemed to acknowledge what the documents had already settled. Harold slowly turned toward me, his expression carrying the quiet respect of someone honoring a promise made years earlier. Mr. Caldwell, he said, would you please join us at the table? The request echoed gently across the room. Every pair of eyes followed me as I stood. My chair slid back without hurry. I buttoned my jacket, picked up nothing, and walked the length of the conference room with the same steady pace I had used when I entered the building that morning. The difference was not in my steps. The difference was in what everyone finally understood those steps represented. Brandon stared at me as though trying to match the man walking toward the head of the table with the person he had joked about less than an hour earlier. Madison remained perfectly still. Her hands rested on the leather portfolio in front of her, but I noticed her fingers tighten slightly against the edge. She was searching every memory she had of our marriage, trying to locate the moment she had missed the truth. There was no single moment. It had disappeared one assumption at a time. Harold stood as I approached. Welcome back, he said quietly. I offered a small nod. Thank you, Harold. It was the first time anyone had heard my voice during the meeting beyond a few polite replies in the hallway. Calm, measured, ordinary, nothing dramatic. Power rarely needs to announce itself. Daniel placed one final folder in front of me. The trust has officially reverted to your direct authority as of 9 o'clock this morning. All transfer documents have been completed. I opened the folder, reviewed the signature page for only a few seconds, and signed my name exactly where the bookmark rested. The pen felt familiar. I had signed thousands of documents over the years, yet this signature carried less excitement than relief. Some journeys do not end with celebration. They end with quiet acceptance that the waiting is finally over. Harold addressed the room once more. For the record, I would like to formally recognize Mr. Ethan Caldwell, founder of Meridian Global Holdings and controlling shareholder through the Caldwell Family Trust. The words settled across the boardroom with surprising weight. Founder. The title seemed almost foreign after so many years of remaining outside public view. One of the newer directors looked visibly stunned. I had no idea. Another slowly shook his head. Neither did I. Brandon finally found his voice. If you founded Meridian, then why leave? It was a fair question. I looked toward the windows overlooking the city before answering. Because companies should be built to outlive the people who start them. I believed Meridian deserved leadership chosen for ability, not for my last name. Nobody interrupted. The trust protected the company while allowing others to build it. Richard expanded what we started together. Every executive who worked with integrity helped strengthen it. I never regretted stepping away. I paused briefly before continuing. I only regret allowing silence to become misunderstanding. My eyes drifted toward Madison for just a second. She lowered hers almost immediately. I remembered another conversation many years earlier after our first profitable quarter. We had driven to Lake Michigan with hamburgers wrapped in paper bags because neither of us could justify spending money at expensive restaurants. Madison leaned against the hood of my old pickup truck watching sailboats move across the water. She smiled and asked me a question I never forgot. If Meridian becomes everything you dream about, what title will you want? I laughed back then because the answer came easily. None. Titles are for business cards. Character is what follows you home. She kissed my cheek and told me that was exactly why she believed in me. Standing inside the boardroom now, I wondered whether she remembered that conversation too. Success changes many things. Memory should never be one of them. Harold cleared his throat gently. We still have one remaining agenda item. Under Article 4 of the corporate bylaws, the board must now elect a chairman before any additional business may proceed. Daniel distributed fresh voting cards to each director. No campaign speeches. No presentations. Just a straightforward legal process. Brandon shifted uneasily in his seat. Madison looked down at the polished table instead of toward anyone else. The confidence that had filled the room earlier that morning had quietly disappeared. In its place stood something much more honest. Reality. Harold looked around the table one final time. Directors, you now have the authority to submit your nomination for chairman of Meridian Global Holdings. Several hands reached for their voting cards at once, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, nobody looked toward Madison as the future everyone expected slowly gave way to the future that had been waiting patiently all along. Harold collected the nomination cards without unnecessary ceremony. There were no campaign speeches because there was nothing left to persuade. The directors had already read the ownership records, reviewed the trust documents, and understood exactly what the bylaws required. Daniel quietly walked beside Harold, verifying each card before placing it into a polished wooden box that had probably witnessed decades of decisions shaping Meridian's future. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered. Even Brandon remained silent, his confidence dissolving beneath the uncomfortable realization that every assumption he had built about me had collapsed in less than 30 minutes. Harold finished counting, looked once toward Daniel for confirmation, and received a simple nod. Then he faced the board. There is one nomination. He paused just long enough for every heartbeat in the room to become noticeable. Mr. Ethan Caldwell. No applause followed. Real boardrooms rarely sound like movies. Instead, directors exchanged brief glances before quietly lifting their voting cards one after another. White cards rose around the walnut table with calm certainty. No hesitation. No debate. Years of legal structure and corporate governance had led to this single moment, and everyone present understood they were witnessing history rather than creating it. Harold looked around the room carefully. All those in favor. Every voting card remained raised. Opposed. None moved. Abstentions. Silence answered again. Harold smiled with quiet satisfaction before speaking the words that officially closed one chapter of my life and opened another. The motion passes unanimously. Effective immediately, Ethan Caldwell is elected chairman of the board of Meridian Global Holdings. The sentence was neither loud nor dramatic, yet it carried enough weight to erase 12 years of anonymity in less than 10 seconds. Daniel extended his hand first. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. I shook it gently. Thank you, Daniel. You kept your promise. He smiled for the first time all morning. Some promises are worth waiting for. Harold stood and stepped away from the chairman's chair. It belongs to you now. I looked at the seat for a brief moment before taking it. The leather felt exactly like any other chair. That was the interesting thing about authority. The furniture never changes. Only the responsibility sitting inside it does. Across the table, Madison remained completely still. Her eyes met mine for only an instant before drifting downward toward the wedding ring on her left hand. She looked less like an ambitious executive who had missed a promotion and more like someone trying to understand how the person she believed she knew had quietly carried an entire history she had stopped seeing. Brandon finally broke the silence. "Why did you never tell anyone?" His voice sounded smaller than before, stripped of the easy confidence that had filled the hallway earlier that morning. I answered honestly. Because I wanted to know who respected people before they respected titles. Nobody challenged the answer. I continued. Titles attract admiration. Character attracts loyalty. I have always found loyalty far more valuable. One elderly director slowly nodded. That explains a great deal. Another smiled thoughtfully. It also explains why Richard never spoke about the founder. Harold looked toward the framed photograph hanging near the entrance. Richard believed Meridian would eventually need its founder again. He simply never knew when that day would come. I rested my hands on the table, looking around the room that had once felt so familiar and then so distant. Today is not about proving anyone wrong, I said. Meridian became successful because many talented people devoted years of honest work to this company. I respect that. I appreciate it. My responsibility now is not to erase what has been built. It is to protect it. Several directors nodded in agreement. The atmosphere gradually shifted from shock toward business. That was another truth about experienced leaders. Once reality became clear, they adapted quickly. Emotions might arrive first, but responsibility usually stayed longer. I noticed Madison looking toward me again, this time with questions she had not asked in years. There had been countless evenings when she could have wondered why I never spoke bitterly about Meridian, why former executives occasionally called just to check on me, why I still read every annual report even after supposedly leaving the corporate world behind. The answers had always been there, quietly waiting inside ordinary moments. She simply stopped looking for them. Outside the windows, sunlight finally spread across the lake, turning the gray water into sheets of silver. Chicago continued moving beneath us exactly as it had before the meeting began. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee, answering calls, worrying about deadlines that seemed important enough to shape an entire day. They had no idea that inside one conference room on the 47th floor, a forgotten founder had quietly returned to the company he never truly left, and a woman who once introduced her husband as someone without purpose now sat across from the man every director had unanimously entrusted with Meridian's future. The meeting continued, but the rhythm had completely changed. The agenda that had once centered on promotions and quarterly projections now revolved around governance, accountability, and the future direction of Meridian. Harold slid the remaining folders toward me before quietly taking a seat among the other directors. For the first time in 12 years, every final decision now stopped at my side of the table. I looked around the room before speaking. Thank you for your confidence. I do not intend to change Meridian overnight. Companies are not strengthened by dramatic gestures. They are strengthened by consistent decisions made for the right reasons. Several directors nodded. I noticed relief in some faces. Change always makes people nervous, even when they welcome it. The leadership team has built a successful business, I continued. My responsibility is to preserve what works, improve what does not, and ensure every decision reflects the values that built this company from the beginning. I paused briefly before adding, respect, accountability, integrity. The final word seemed to linger a little longer than the others. Daniel quietly placed another folder beside me. Mr. Chairman, there is one remaining governance recommendation prepared by the audit committee. I opened the folder without rushing. Inside were several pages summarizing internal reviews that had been delayed until the trust transfer became effective. Nothing criminal, nothing sensational. Simply documentation identifying conflicts of interest, weak internal controls, and repeated policy exceptions involving executive leadership. The type of problems that slowly weaken organizations if nobody addresses them. I looked up. Thank you, Daniel. Brandon shifted uneasily in his chair. Is there something we should discuss? I met his eyes calmly. Yes. Every conversation stopped immediately. Meridian has grown quickly over the past decade. Growth creates opportunity, but it also creates blind spots. Effective today, I am authorizing a full independent governance audit across every executive division, including finance, operations, procurement, and senior leadership. The announcement landed quietly, Yet several directors immediately exchanged approving glances. One of them spoke first. "Frankly, that is overdue." Another nodded. "I agree completely." Brandon forced a polite smile that looked increasingly difficult to maintain. "Surely that is unnecessary. Our last internal review was positive." Daniel answered before I could. Internal reviews measure compliance. Independent governance reviews evaluate decision-making, oversight, and executive conduct. They are very different processes. Brandon looked down at the table without responding. I turned another page. During the audit, no executive appointments will become permanent until all findings have been completed. Madison slowly lifted her eyes toward me. She understood exactly what that meant. Her expected promotion had not been canceled, but it had been placed on hold indefinitely. Not as punishment, as procedure. The distinction mattered. Fairness is often far more uncomfortable than revenge, because fairness leaves very little to argue against. Madison finally spoke, her voice quieter than I had heard in years. "Chairman Caldwell." She hesitated after saying my title, almost surprised by the words herself. "May I ask a question?" I nodded. "Of course." She looked directly at me for the first time since the vote. "Did you know, before today, that I believed you were no longer connected to Meridian?" I answered honestly. "Yes." "Why did you never correct me?" The room became still again. It was a personal question asked in a professional setting, but nobody seemed eager to interrupt. I considered my answer carefully. Because truth, offered voluntarily, carries more value than truth demanded. I never hid anything from you. I simply stopped insisting that you believe me. Madison lowered her eyes again. I continued gently, not only for her, but for everyone listening. There were annual reports on our kitchen table every year. Board newsletters arrived at our home. Former executives occasionally invited us to company events. I accepted every invitation. You stopped asking why. Nobody spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was reflective. Sometimes the most painful realization is discovering that the answers had always been sitting quietly in front of us. Harold folded his hands together with a thoughtful smile. "One lesson I learned after 40 years in business is that assumptions are the most expensive shortcuts any leader can take." Several directors quietly agreed. I closed the audit folder. This review is not about finding people to blame. It is about making sure Meridian remains worthy of the trust placed in it by employees, customers, and shareholders. We owe them that responsibility. The atmosphere inside the room gradually settled into something steadier. The uncertainty of the morning had transformed into disciplined focus. Directors began discussing timelines, outside consulting firms, and governance procedures. Business had returned. Yet beneath every ordinary conversation, something far more personal remained unresolved. Madison sat silently reviewing papers she was no longer reading. Brandon avoided looking in my direction altogether. Outside the conference room, employees continued walking through the executive hallway believing it was just another Tuesday. None of them realized that inside those glass walls, a company had regained its founder, a board had quietly restored its original leadership, and a marriage built over nearly 2 decades had revealed a fracture that no corporate vote could ever repair. The board meeting officially adjourned just after noon. Directors gathered their folders, exchanged quiet conversations about implementation schedules, and slowly filtered toward the hallway. The tension that had filled the room all morning had transformed into something far more professional. Decisions had been made. Responsibilities had been assigned. Meridian would move forward. I remained seated for another minute, watching the empty chairs surrounding the long walnut table. 12 years had passed between the day I quietly stepped away and the day I quietly returned. The room felt different now, but not because of the furniture or the view outside the windows. It felt different because the truth no longer needed to hide behind silence. Daniel approached first. "The transition team will be ready tomorrow morning." I nodded. "Good. Let everyone know there will be no unnecessary restructuring. People should focus on their work, not on rumors." He smiled. "That is exactly what Richard hoped you would say." Before leaving, he paused for a moment. "He always believed you would come back when Meridian needed you, not when your pride did." I looked toward the city skyline beyond the glass. He knew me well. Daniel offered a respectful nod before quietly closing the conference room door behind him. The room became completely silent. A few seconds later, I heard careful footsteps approaching from the opposite side of the table. Madison stopped several feet away. She no longer looked like the executive who had entered the meeting that morning full of confidence and certainty. She simply looked tired. "May we talk?" she asked softly. I looked at the chair across from me. "Please." She sat down slowly, resting both hands on the table. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Sometimes the hardest conversations begin after every prepared sentence disappears. Finally, she broke the silence. "I have been replaying this morning in my head." I waited. "I cannot stop hearing what I said about you." Her voice grew quieter. "I thought it was harmless. I thought everyone would laugh for a second and move on." I answered gently. "They did move on. That was the problem." She looked confused. I continued. "Nobody questioned why it was acceptable to laugh. Not even you." Her eyes lowered toward the polished wood. "You are right." Another long silence settled between us. Outside, sunlight reflected across Lake Michigan, turning the water into bright ribbons beneath the autumn sky. The city continued living its ordinary Tuesday while ours had quietly changed forever. Madison finally looked back at me. "Did you stop loving me?" I thought carefully before answering, because some questions deserve honesty more than comfort. "No." She seemed surprised. "Then what changed?" I folded my hands together. Respect slowly disappeared. Love can survive difficult years. It struggles to survive repeated disrespect. She nodded slowly as tears gathered in her eyes, though she never looked away. I kept measuring people by promotions, salaries, and titles. Somewhere along the way, I forgot who believed in me before I had any of those things. I remembered the small apartment, the folding chairs, the paper coffee cups, the late nights planning a future that once belonged equally to both of us. Those memories still existed. They simply belonged to a different season of our lives. "Success did not change you overnight," I said quietly. "It happened one small decision at a time. One assumption, one conversation, one joke. Eventually, the person sitting across from you became someone you believed was beneath you." She closed her eyes briefly. "I am sorry, Ethan." The apology sounded sincere. Perhaps it was the most sincere thing she had said in years. I believe she regretted what had happened. Regret, however, cannot travel backward through time. It can only teach us how to move forward. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed my wedding ring. For a brief moment, I held it between my fingers before placing it gently on the conference table. There was no anger behind the gesture, only acceptance. "This morning was never about proving that I was successful," I said. "It was about discovering whether the people closest to me still recognized the man I had always been." Madison stared at the ring without speaking. "I built Meridian because I believed great companies should treat people with dignity regardless of their title. I wanted my marriage to reflect that same principle." I stood slowly, adjusted my jacket, and looked around the boardroom one last time. Today I became chairman because the board placed its trust in me. I hope I earn that trust every single day. But the title means far less than the lesson this morning reminded me of. I walked toward the conference room door before stopping briefly with my hand on the handle. Without turning around, I spoke one final sentence. "Never underestimate the quiet person standing beside you. You may not know their title, but you will always reveal your own character by the way you treat them." Then I opened the door, stepped into the executive hallway, and walked toward the future I had helped build long ago, carrying no satisfaction from anyone else's embarrassment, only the quiet certainty that truth never needs to raise its voice to be heard.